everyone, I'm JD from Willowbound Journals, and today I have a Booktube video for you as I do some journaling in my reading journal. I made this journal out of a book that I thrifted from an op shop. It was free, it was falling apart, and I just put together the spine, bound in my own signatures, and this is where I record the books that I read. And I am very much behind, so I'm trying to catch up slowly. And as you watch me just journal in the background, I thought I would do the mid-year book tag. And I know we're a bit past mid-year, but I really wanted to do this last year as well and didn't quite get to it. So finally this year I'm going to give it a go. I love tags, I love questions, and I'm so excited to get into this. And the first question is, best book you've read so far? And wow, there are so many books this year that I loved reading, but I am going to try to narrow my answers down to one per each question and maybe do some honourable mentions, but I was going to spread them out as well. So if there was a book that could fill multiple categories, I try to only place it in one category. So one of the best books I've read so far was Anxious People by Frederick Backman. The first book I ever read by him was A Man Called Ove, or Ovie, I think it is, and I really, really enjoyed that book. That was one of my favourite books that I read in a previous year. So heartfelt, so tender, and so moving. And so this is the second book that I read by Frederick Backman. A full-size book anyway. I read a little novella in between. But this one, I wasn't sure what to expect. I found it in an op shop and I loved it. It's a mystery and it involves a group of people and you get to know them, you get to know their stories, and you just really love all of them. You get to love them all. And it's really interesting finding out how they're all connected to each other and how they kind of get to know each other. And at first, some of them don't like each other, but by the end, they all bond and come to understand each other. And it's just, again, so very heartwarming. And I cried multiple times at the end because it sort of wraps up each of the people's stories at the end. And each time it wrapped up their stories, it made me cry. And then the final, there's a little twist at the end. There's twists throughout the book, one that I just did not see coming at all. And I want to go back and read it again now that I know all of these twists. And then finally at the very end, there's one last little subtle twist that was, again, just so tender, so moving. Really, really good book. I am keeping it and I will definitely read it again and recommend it. The next question is, best sequel you've read so far? And I'm going to go with Bright Shining. So there are some other books that would contend that are contenders for this question, but I read them past July. So I'm trying to limit the books that I read, my answers to the questions, to the books that I've read just until July. So I'm going to go with Bright Shining. But if you did want to know the other book that I have since read since July, it was The Atlas Paradox, which is the sequel to The Atlas 6, which I absolutely loved, but I read that after July. So prior to July, I read Bright Shining by Julia Baird. Her first book I read the previous year, and it was called Phosphorescence. And that book is very meaningful to me. It came at the right time in my life when I was actually not doing so well. I was in a bit of a dark place. I had just been sick for a week. And so I was in a pretty miserable headspace. And that book just brought me out back into the phosphorescent light. And it just reminded me, that my problems aren't really problems. There are bigger problems in the world than just being sick. And it helped me come up with this quote where there is beauty and sorrow and suffering all around us that we just have no idea about. And I want my eyes to be opened to the beauty and the suffering around me. And I every day want to help make the world a more beautiful and bright place, and help ease suffering each day. And so the sequel, or another book after this, was Bright Shining, and they're non-fiction books, and this one is about grace, and it kind of looks at like the definition of grace and how different people define grace, what grace looks like in different contexts, and just another encouraging, uplifting book. The next question is a new release you haven't read but want to. So that one for me would be the third and final book in the Atlas series. So I mentioned that the first one is the Atlas 6. The second one is the Atlas Paradox. I read both of those this year. The third one is called the Atlas Complex. And every time I go to the shop, it's not there. So I'm hoping when I go to Melbourne, surely there will be a bookshop in Melbourne that will have the Atlas Complex. But I'm kind of okay with having not found it yet, because I'm waiting for the small version to come out. You know, when they come out as a new release, they're often the big size. And I prefer the smaller size. It's easier to read. It's easier to hold in my hand. It's more comfortable. And the other two books that I've got in the series, they're small versions. So I'm hoping I find the small version in Melbourne. I'm not sure if the small version's come out yet. If it hasn't, I'm just going to go ahead and get the big version anyway, if it's there, because it's a really good series. It's a series by Olivia Blake, and a friend recommended it to me. And it's a genre that I never knew existed, called dark academia. I actually really like this genre. And what I love about Olivia Blake's writing is she's very psychological, very philosophical sort of writing style, where you get right into the characters' heads. They're very character-driven stories rather than plot. You get to hear their thoughts, and just the interaction between characters is really, really fun and very, very involved. And I love her writing style because it's so observant. It's like she sees into my own head and sees my own thoughts and that kind of thing. So very, very cool writing. The biggest disappointment. There are a few contenders for this one. One of them was also by Olivia Blake, because my friend recommended a book called Alone with You in the Ether, which is one of the books that we read for the Willow Book Club. But my friend, because I mentioned how I loved Atlas 6, and she was the one who introduced me to Atlas 6 as well, and I was talking to my friend about it and saying what I love is the psychological aspect and the deep thinking part of it and the philosophy part of it. So she's like, oh, well then you will love Alone with You in the Ether. And I read it and I chatted to her about it afterwards, and I was just saying, I really did enjoy all the psychological aspect of it. I loved getting into the characters' heads and hearing the way that they think and the way they interact. Loved all of that, very similar to the Atlas series. But the thing was, it was just a straight romance, and I got quite bored in the end. And I was just saying to my friend that I can do romance. I like when there's a romance subplot in books, but often that can't be just the entire plot for me. That's why I really loved the Atlas series, because yes, you've got all these characters, but there's 6 of them and they interact. And it's really interesting. Each of the 6 characters are very, very interesting, and there's romantic subplots throughout, but it's more focused on the 6 of them and how they interact, which I love. It's so engaging, so intriguing. Whereas Alone with You in the Ether, you're just stuck with these 2 characters. I didn't particularly like either of them. And so that was one disappointment. I'll just give 2 honorable mentions. There were 2 books that I read for the local book club that I'm part of. One was called House of Hollow. The other was called The House in the Pines. We think it's funny because of the house commonality there. I was so looking forward to reading both of them. House of Hollow was something different for me. It was a bit of like a fantasy, it was sold to me as like a modern day fairy tale. And House in the Pines, that was presented as a mystery thriller, like a psychological thriller. So I was very, very excited, and I was just really bored in both of them. And there were, both of them, of course, had interesting parts to them and some parts that were well done. I always say even the worst book, like subjectively, can teach you something, and there's something good in there. And I want to commend all authors. Even if I don't personally enjoy a book, I can still always get something from a book and learn from it. Even if it's like a 0 star or a 1 star, I get to learn about writing. I get to learn what I like or what I don't like. I get to learn and pull out something good from it, even if it's not a book I enjoy. But the thing for me is, the worst thing a book can be for me is boring. I remember when I borrowed A Man Called Ove at the library, and the librarian said to me, "Oh, I really hope you don't mind feeling things." And I was like, not at all. If a book can make me feel something, that is a wonderful book in my eyes. Even if it's not one I enjoy, if it can make me feel something, it's done its job. A book that that makes me bored, I feel like hasn't really done its job. So the next question is the biggest surprise. So for me, there's a few candidates here again, but I'm going to go with, like, Atlas 6 could have been one of them, because, like I said, I'd never known about the genre of dark academia, so that was a huge surprise. But I'm going to go with Iron Flame, which is a fantasy, and it was one that my sister recommended to me, actually, and I really enjoyed it. It was quite surprising, because when I read the back, it was talking about, it's about dragons, and I was like, oh, that's been done so many times before, this is going to be boring. But I read it, loved it, and it had such a fun take on dragons. Like, they were my favorite characters. The dragons were my favorite characters. I loved their personalities. One in particular was just really sweet and gentle, and I really loved her. And then one of the other dragons, he was fantastic. He was a bit snarky, and he was a bit, he was lovable, but had a bit of an attitude. It was so fun to read. So Iron Flame, I really enjoyed the world building of it too. Yes, there are some criticisms of it, but I just loved kind of like the history behind it, and that it was so involved. Like, there were books written about the history within the book, that type of thing. So Iron Flame, really enjoyed that book. The next question is newest favorite author. So yeah, I could definitely go with Olivia Blake, because I love the Atlas series. And I could also go with, since I've already mentioned Olivia Blake in this tag, I'm going to go with a different author, and I'm going to go with R.F. Kuang. I'm not sure if that's how you say it. But she wrote Babel, which was one of our books for the Willow Book Club. And Babel is one of my favorite books that I read this year. I'll talk about that a bit later, because that comes up in a different question. So R.F. Kuang, she's got another book called Yellowface, which I really want to read. And my friend, the same one who recommended the Atlas books, she recommended to me the Poppy War trilogy, which is also by this same author. So I'm so keen to get stuck into more of her books, more of her writing, because her writing is so sophisticated. It reminds me of Olivia Blake, actually. If I didn't know any different, I would have thought Babel was written by Olivia Blake. Very kind of psychological. You get right into the characters' heads, and super smart, super intellectual books. Lots of like good stuff in it. Like, I love books that make you think and make you work. So I'll talk a bit more about that later. But the next question is a book that made you cry. Well, I've already mentioned it, but Anxious People definitely made me cry multiple times. And if I could choose another book, I would say Honeybee, because I can't include it in this tag just because I read it after July. But I just want to put that as a bit of an honourable mention. Honeybee is the most recent book that I read, and it was for my local book club, and it made me cry multiple times as well. But yeah, the next question is a book that made you happy. And I'm going to give this one to Babel because I took this book away with me on my little holiday with my sister and nephew in Mackay. And when we go on holidays, we all bring books, and it's just a chance for us to rest and relax and get a lot of reading done because we all love reading. So I took Babel because it's quite a large book, very small writing. I thought this would be the perfect chance to just power through it and get through it. So I loved it. From the moment I picked it up, the first page, I was in the story straight away, and sort of nothing makes me happier when a book can make me just be so in the story straight away. A book where everything else falls away and I'm just in that world. I'm in the book world. And every time that I came out and I had read a bit more, I'd just have this smile on my face and tell my sister, I love this book. It's such a good book. And a good book makes me happy. Finding a good book is one of the best feelings. I love finding a page turner. I love finding a book that you just can't wait to get back into, a book where you just keep turning page after page and you just love being in that world, and it's so interesting. And I don't know, it just is, as a book lover, they're the books you live for. They're the books that make you happy. And Babel, yeah, the review, one of the reviews says it's a sweeping epic, and it sure is. And I love that about it too. Really interesting, engaging characters. It's a magical fantasy. So it's it's a historical fantasy, but the fantasy elements is quite small. It could be a historical fiction. So I really loved learning about translation and learning about the history behind certain words. And it's basically a book about colonialism and how translation can help to define cultures and economies, and how it can be used in a cruel way or in a helpful way, and just epic. It's so epic and so good. The next question is most meaningful book you've bought or received. Well, I'm going to go with a book that I bought, and I bought it as an ebook, and it's called You Could Make This Place Beautiful. This could have been the best book I've read so far, along with Anxious People, but since I already mentioned that there, I'm going to mention this one now. And the most meaningful book, oh my goodness, this one, it's a non-fiction, it's a memoir, and it's just well written. So this is one of those types of books where I love it more because of how it's written than what it's written about. It's about this lady who gets a divorce from her husband and how she found out, and just her journey going through that horrible process, and trying to find light at the end of the tunnel, navigating that with her family, and just the pain of that and the emotions she goes through and all that kind of thing. But the way she wrote about it, the structure, the style, was just life-changing for me, because as a writer myself, I love finding out how books are structured. And if I find a book, book structure for me is everything. When I did a Master of Writing in Literature, I discovered creative nonfiction. And what I loved about creative nonfiction more than any other genre of writing was that you can play around with structure and it doesn't have to look conventional. And her book, You Could Make This Place Beautiful, is structured so completely differently to anything I've ever seen before, with repeating chapter titles, with one chapter being just a quote, and then the next chapter being one paragraph, and then the following chapter being 10 pages, and then it goes back to a scene from a movie or from a play, and it just plays around with different ways of writing and structure, and it was just engaging. It was a page turner. I couldn't put it down because I'm what's going to be the next chapter like? That sentence did not come out right. What will the next chapter be like? How is this writing going to be next? And there was poetry in there, and there was monologues in there, and it was just so cool. As a writer, I thought it was fantastic. It blew my mind. It broadened my horizons of what's possible, how to write a book, and that's how I like to write a book. I like writing books where I get to play around with the structure. So very inspiring book. It's super inspiring, very impactful, and it's shaping how I want to write future books. The next question is a book you really need to read by the end of the year. I'm just going to list off some of the books that are still on my to read list that I've started but haven't quite finished yet. So the first one is Rembrandt is in the Wind. I've got it as an ebook and I've got about 80% through, so I could pretty much finish that quickly. And that's about art and faith. And then there's another one called No Bad Parts, another one called The Gift of Therapy, another one called Atlas of the Heart. And these are more kind of psychological books, so non-fiction. And yeah, they're all good books and looking forward to finishing those eventually. And I think that is the last question. And so I just want to give, I don't know where to fit this in, so that this is why I'm kind of adding my own little question or category, and that is a book that didn't make this list but you want to mention. And that is The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by, I think it's John Mark Comer. This is a book that a friend let me borrow and that so many friends were telling me I should read, that they all loved it. And I finally read it and I absolutely loved it too. And I want to buy a copy because it was that good. And that means it's a 5-star rating. If I give a book a 5-star rating, it means it's a book I want to own and a book I want to reread. So I really want to get that book. I'm hoping I might be able to find it in Melbourne when I go to Coorong, and I want to highlight it, annotate it. I want to take notes. I want to let it impact my life and shape my everyday living. It's about slowing down, not being on technology and social media so much, but slowing down, spending more time with God, and just, all these good things for my well-being and for identity. And so good. I love this book and I would love to talk a bit more about it in a future video, about some different things that I've been learning from it and how I want to apply it to my life. It sort of goes along with my intentional life course. A lot of the things it covers in there line up with the things I'm already the things I already value with the intentional life course, where I want to look at how I spend my time and my schedule and really live intentionally and not waste it, scrolling through social media or checking my email 10 times every single hour, that kind of thing. So yeah, I will definitely chat about that later on. But yeah, if you'd like to be part of the Willow Book Club, feel free to check the link down below. It's just a Facebook group and I just suggest books that I'm reading. If anyone wants to join me with that. And there's a book a month and there's no obligation to read the same book, but it's just a place to chat about books and share any book hauls or a book that you love or a book you recommend, that kind of thing. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out. I'm loving being part of 2 book clubs because it's getting me reading more widely. I love reading across genres. I love reading all sorts of books to learn, to grow as a person, to grow as a reader, as a writer, and to let it impact my day-to-day life. That's why I think even if there's a book I don't enjoy, I can still learn from it. I can learn about myself. I can learn about the world. And that's always a good thing. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books that I mentioned. Feel free to answer any of these questions yourselves. And I look forward to chatting about books with you and look forward to sharing some more Booktube videos in the future as well. If you have any questions about books, I would love to hear them as well and would love to answer them. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.